All right, well, why don't we get started? If we have a couple more people come in, that's fine. I'm sure that the proctor will let them in. So how many people are new to Red Hat Summit? First Red Hat Summit. Whoa, that is so cool. I've been here for 5.5 years, and my first summit was in Boston, and you know, it was at the Heinz. I don't know if any of you have been to Boston at the Heinz, but it's a very small, kind of old, dark, auditorium-like convention center. And then, you know, we decided to move back and forth between the East Coast and the West Coast. And I just love being in San Francisco. It's a different vibe. It's cool. We do get different customers, right? We get customers that come from Asia Pacific because it's a shorter journey. Lots of innovation, that kind of thing. So welcome to everybody that's new. And for those of you who are alumni like me, welcome back. There's always something new to learn. And you know, Jim said that this is his favorite week. I can tell you that being a Red Hatter, we do call ourselves Red Hatters, about February, it just starts, we call it the Death March to Summit. It's just like everybody, you've got your product announcements and engineering work has to be done, and you know, making sure that we have all of our announcements lined up and we've got the speakers lined up. So this week is really the culmination of a lot of us putting in, you know, the hard work on behalf of you, our customers, and our partners. So welcome. And during this week, obviously, there's a lot of sessions. What I'm going to be talking about today is hybrid cloud deployments. I'm going to be touching on DevOps as well as operations. So if I could, again, I'm not going to do the show of hands through the whole presentation, guys, but just to help me, how many developers do we have in the audience? Just a schmattering. Okay. And how many operations folks or admins? Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to be talking about both because it's important, an important topic for both types of folks. So feel free to ask questions at the end. We'll have a Q&A session. I've got a lot of material to cover, and I do want to say that we had a little AV issue this morning. So instead of me seeing my slides here, I can only see them there. I'm not ignoring you, but I do want to make sure that I keep on message. So if you see me always looking over there, that's why. A little bit about me. I've managed our Certified Cloud and Service Provider program for the last 5.5 years at Red Hat. I work with many of our account teams and working with customers who are deploying public clouds and how to use public clouds in a hybrid cloud deployment. So when you hear me talk about some of the things, considerations, that kind of thing, that's from 5 years of working this evolution. And just like Jim was talking about, you know, the Industrial Revolution and innovation, 5.5 years ago, I mean, there were 5 people in the audience when I talked about this. So we're really getting to the point now where public clouds can be a platform for innovation, but there are certain considerations, there's certain things we want to avoid. And so I'm here to hopefully kind of guide you down the path, give you some, in 40, 45 minutes, give you some considerations, but then hopefully send you off in paths where you can actually do your own homework. Because in 45 minutes, that's not a lot of time for us to cover. So this is what we're going to discuss today. What's the reality today? And we'll talk about hybrid cloud and multi-cloud as well, because that's important for a lot of you, right? You don't want to be locked into one cloud, or for whatever reason, for applications, for availability, for regions, et cetera, you have a multi-cloud approach. Understanding what your options are for hybrid cloud deployments, and then what are the pitfalls to avoid, and then looking at hybrid cloud management, why that's important, what Red Hat has to offer in hybrid cloud management, and why certifications are important. So we talk about innovation, but we want to make sure that we're safe when we use public clouds or a hybrid cloud approach. We want to make sure that, that everything that you have in your data center is, as much as possible, applies to public cloud use. And then I'll talk about the program and also cloud access, which is our portability method to move to public clouds, and then we'll wrap up with a summary. Okay. Hybrid clouds are a reality. So IDC in the 2015 did a poll of enterprise customers, and about 80% of them said that, yes, they're going to have a hybrid cloud strategy by next year. So, you know, we're way beyond this whole crossing the chasm business. We're like actually in production deployments and cloud first and cloud native applications. 60% of the respondents also said that they have a multi-cloud strategy. So this is a production reality. This isn't testing the waters anymore. This is actually enterprises saying we are going cloud first. And that would include using multiple public clouds as well as private clouds in their data center. And it's really being driven by the lines of business we're seeing. So it's an IT initiative, but the lines of business are the ones that are pushing IT in a cloud-first way. And why is that? Because they're looking at it as time to innovate. They're trying to figure out how they're going to capture the market, or how they're going to be the leaders in their market. And if you can go out and requisition a VM, spin up a VM, get a full, rich library of tools, languages, resources on a public cloud, why would you then take days to requisition the same out of your IT organization? So IT is being driven to using public cloud as a platform. And then digital transformation, so moving from where we had systems of record to actually systems of engagement. So if you think of things like static CRM systems to data analytics, those are some of the reasons why we're using hybrid cloud. But along with that comes some challenges, right? It's a level of complexity. So you've got some sort of integration you got to do with your own IT organization. It's now heterogeneous, so it's both a mix of virtual as well as bare metal, and then you add maybe hosted bare metal, then you add public clouds like AWS and Azure, and now you've suddenly got to manage all of that. And by the way, that's your responsibility. That is not the public cloud provider's responsibility. It's up to you to set up the controls, and we're going to talk about that. And then security, how do you manage your security, performance, and also looking at compliance when you incorporate a hybrid cloud. Throughout the session today, one of the things that I like to talk about is don't think of a public cloud or a hoster as a separate platform. Because when you do that, then you start applying attributes to it that are different than in your data center. What you really should be doing, if you're in an operational role or an admin, is think of that platform as an extension of your data center and your environment. So whatever requirements you have in your data center, you need to look for public cloud providers that have those same attributes and build those into your own private clouds as well. And that's why things like security and compliance, you've already got those in your data centers. And by the way, if you're developers, you hate that stuff. I know you hate that stuff. So we'll talk about speed to development as well. So what are your options for hybrid cloud? So we're moving from traditional virtualized environment now to private cloud deployments. And I'm just going to give an overview on the next slide of all of Red Hat solutions and where they fit, because I think we're at the top of Summit now, and this is a good place for you guys to kind of figure out what sessions you want to go to, what technologies you want to find out more about. So I'm just going to give you basically an overview, and then for the rest of Summit, I encourage you to explore those different sessions where you want more details. There's also hosted dedicated private clouds. So an example of a hosted dedicated private cloud provider would be Rackspace, where they build out private clouds just for individual customers, and that's customized to their requirements, and that's backed with a high service level. They just recently, Rackspace in February, announced a Rackspace private cloud powered by Red Hat OpenStack. So, and that's backed by Ceph. So, for instance, if you're interested in Red Hat OpenStack and you're saying, I need a dedicated environment, but I don't want to build it all out myself, you might want to look at a provider like Rackspace. Also, managed services providers using public cloud. So the landscape of where we were, like in 2012 and 2013, we had AWS and we had everybody else. Now it's AWS and everybody else is fighting for what is their secret sauce, right? And so we're seeing cloud and hosters really looking at managed services, and we're seeing managed service providers saying, we don't want to be in the business of standing up our own infrastructure, but we want a piece of that pie with cloud services. So the managed service providers are now starting to use AWS or Google or Azure as the platform. And what they can do for you is they can provide you a complete solution. And when they do that, then it may even be oblivious to you what the platform is, or they may give you a choice of those. So we're really seeing the lines blur between what is really public cloud use. But what that does is it gives you a lot of options, a lot more options than you had even 3 years ago. So Red Hat solutions, just to give you an overview, and again, I would encourage you to seek out individual sessions. Some of them will be in this room. This is sort of the cloud services room. But we're going to be doing roadmaps, technical deep dives. There's labs on every single one of our solutions areas. So please avail yourselves of those while you're here this week. For private cloud, we obviously have Red Hat OpenStack. That's backed by self-storage. It includes with Red Hat Cloud Infrastructure, that also includes CloudForms. So you could think of RHCI or Red Hat Cloud Infrastructure as your complete cloud infrastructure. For public cloud, we offer Red Hat Enterprise Linux and some of our other products directly on public cloud providers, and I'll go through that in a few minutes. Red Hat Cloud Access, which is our portability, moving subscriptions to public clouds, and I'll also talk about that. For platform as a service, oh my goodness, I hope you all know about OpenShift, because if you subscribe to Red Hat newsletter, I'm sure you've heard of all the OpenShift announcements we've been making over the last year. It's been really phenomenal, the growth in OpenShift, and you will hear more this week. I'm not going to spoil. I'm not a spoiler. I'm not allowed to do that, but you will hear more OpenShift announcements. But essentially, platform as a service, which you can host on your private cloud or in a virtualized environment, your choice, or then you could take that to a public cloud if you don't want to stand up that infrastructure yourself. The other option, obviously, is to use OpenShift Online, which is a pay-as-you-go that you get from Red Hat, or to stand up OpenShift Dedicated, which, again, is a dedicated hosted environment that's provided to you by Red Hat. And you might want that for things like performance reasons, security, et cetera. So when we look at how we define hybrid, last year was all about mode 1 and mode 2. That really doesn't fit where we see innovation being driven today. But I do think it's worth acknowledging that we still have traditional applications that we have to maintain. And we'll talk about workloads in a minute. And then there's the cloud applications. So we're seeing more and more customers moving to a clouds first, basically coming from the CIO. And what that means is either using SaaS applications, replacing what they have on premise. It means building out their own infrastructure for private cloud and then utilizing public clouds where it makes sense. And it also means that the applications that they're driving to their end customers are cloud native. So that's kind of how I like to talk about it this year. Next year, don't quote me on this. Nobody has a recorder on it. But it'll be something different because we'll be at a different place, right, with our innovation. But we still need to think about those traditional applications, either based on bare metal or vert. Am I going too fast? I feel kind of like I'm going like 50 miles an hour here. Should I just slow down? Okay, I won't. I had a tall coffee this morning. So pitfalls to avoid. This is always, I don't like to put things in negatives, but you do really need to think about some of these areas, and we'll go into them in a little bit of detail. Understanding your workloads, what is appropriate for cloud and for hybrid cloud deployments, some of the things you need to think about there, both from a development point of view as well as an operational point of view. And your management tools, your cloud management tools, if you haven't looked at your management environment in a while, now's the time to do it as you're moving to public clouds or using hybrid clouds. Understanding your risk and security, really important, and compliance too. And then understanding support models when you incorporate public clouds in your environment. What does that mean? Choosing a cloud provider. How do you choose the right cloud provider? Do you just kind of out of the air, or are you really looking closely at what they can provide, not just from a cost basis, because that's an easy way to compare them, but also into what kind of services they provide, what kind of support they provide, regions of operation, that kind of thing. And then avoiding cloud lock-in. There's a lot in the media today about that, so we'll talk a little bit about how to avoid that. How do you port your applications, your data, your licenses, all of your agreements? How does that span when you move to public cloud? And then finally, What kind of consumption models are there? So, you know, one thing you want to avoid is being locked into a particular consumption model because there's no other choice when you're using a public cloud. So workload considerations. I was mentioning a minute ago about traditional versus cloud-first type of applications. So we still have traditional applications that are in our data centers today. And, you know, they're running fine. They are, you know, keeping the lights on, but very oftentimes it could be, you know, one database with maybe 3 or 4 other feeder databases, and then you've, you know, bolted on some front ends to that, and you've got a bunch of APIs, and you've got a tangle of networking, and you've got multiple data centers involved. Is that like the best application to move to a cloud architecture? You may be forced by, or not forced, but you may be it might be highly recommended by the line of business that you either completely replace that application or re-architect it. But I would say to you that just assuming that you're going to take that application that's, you know, 10 years old and just move it to a public cloud is probably going to be difficult. So when you look at your traditional applications, those things that are running fine, that may not be the first choice when you're starting to look at clouds. You might want to look at, you know, either starting from scratch or looking at a smaller application that you can basically move to the cloud. However, we're not seeing a lot of customers doing this lifting and shifting. You can hear AWS talk about that all the time. Oh yeah, you know, GE is moving 5,000 applications to AWS. I am sure there is a lot of re-architecture of those applications, no doubt, in order to make them run better on AWS and take advantage of AWS services. This is not just, you know, take it from the data center and put it over public cloud. There does have to be work done. Now, that's an opportunity for you developers in here to understand how to take advantage of a lot of the agile services and tools and languages and libraries that are available and runtimes that are available on clouds today that you didn't have in the past. And, you know, OpenShift obviously is one, but there's others out there as well. Another thing you want to think about is the line of business requirements. So we're seeing, as I said before, IT is being driven by the line of business. If you don't already have those interlocks with your lines of business to figure out where they actually are going to be getting their money from, where the revenue's coming from, you need to have those discussions. And I know sometimes an operational role or an IT role, you know, kind of removed from that high-level thinking, but you really need to understand where the business is going before you actually have a strategy for hybrid cloud, because they will be driving a lot of that. You need to think about your data management and your security considerations. So for data management, think about managing this entire environment. What you don't want to have is a separate management environment for public cloud and a separate one for private cloud or virtualization in your data center. That's not going to work. That's not going to give you the best utilization of resources and help you with things like making sure you have security in place and making sure you have good management and good cost controls. So you need a unified cloud management platform. And for security, your InfoSec folks are going to require that you have the same security policies in place on a public cloud that you do have in the data center. So when we talk about hybrid cloud, it isn't an either or an or for any of this, it's and. And that can be kind of daunting, which is why, you know, we're seeing customers now in production, but it's taken them, you know, 3 or 4 years before they've actually solved some of these problems. So when we talk about managing, you know, we talk about hybrid cloud deployments. CloudForms is really, you know, where we talk about a unified, complete life cycle of cloud management. So that spans, you know, all the virtualized environments, VMware, Hyper-V, obviously Rev, private cloud built out by Red Hat OpenStack, and then on public cloud, AWS as well as Azure, which we announced earlier this year, and then I have up here, this is new, GCP. So that's Google Compute Platform. And so we did an announcement or a blog on CloudForms 4.1. If you haven't seen it, make sure you get out there, read about it. There is a CloudForms roadmap session, which I highly recommend that you attend. If you're interested in hybrid cloud management, go into a lot of good detail there, and there's also some labs on CloudForms. But cloud, it basically gives you an entire environment for doing things like provisioning your VMs, understanding which one of your VMs is patched and which ones aren't. And if you want to set up a policy to say, if these VMs are not patched within this particular period of time, then we're shutting them down. You know, from an operational and security point of view, that's really kind of critical. Understanding from an analytical point of view, it gives you a whole reporting mechanism so you can understand what your utilization is, and maybe then that helps you with your resource management. So I highly recommend that you look at CloudForms. And when we talk about hybrid cloud, CloudForms likes to talk, they're the Switzerland, right? So you'll see them add on more cloud providers, more virtualized environments, and you know, from a private cloud deployment, take advantage of everything that our OpenStack provides you, and more services. And then as far as managing your patching and your updating, do we have any satellite customers? I told you I wouldn't do that again, I'm sorry, but it is a point. So those of you who are not familiar with satellite, basically satellite is a complete automated content management system for all of your updates and your patching. And it allows you to deploy updates and patches to thousands of VMs at a single time, and to manage that if you're an operations folks, and to deploy other entitlements, to spin up VMs, et cetera. One of the considerations that I hear all the time from customers when they start using public clouds is, how do I get my updates? Am I responsible for that? Does the cloud provider give those to me? Can I use the similar patching tools that I have internally? So if it's not satellite, it's something else you're using. Well, I'm happy to tell you, with satellite, you can use satellite with our public cloud deployments. And if you have an SA, the SA is perfectly capable in Red Hat SA of showing you how to do that. But basically, you reconfigure satellite to point to the VMs that are located on the public cloud. And at that point, then you can assign entitlements, you can do your updates, you can do your management. What it won't do is it won't know about a VM that's being spun up on demand. So if you use pay-as-you-go, say on AWS or Google, satellite's not going to be able to do that management for you. But in a minute, when I talk about the cloud provider program, I will talk about updating, because we do provide that, and we require our cloud providers to provide that. So if you're using cloud access and you're moving your subscriptions to a public cloud, definitely, if you're a satellite user, take advantage of that, reconfigure it. You can manage all of your, again, unified platform for doing updating. We talked about, you know, pitfalls to avoid is understanding risk. So in order to minimize or mitigate risk, you first have to understand what your risk is. So again, these are just some guidelines in the short time we have today that you want to think about and maybe go do some research on. The first one is third-party auditability. If you're working in a highly regulated industry, financial services, you know, credit cards or insurance, anything like that, where you're taking in lots of personal data or information, financial information, you're going to be required in your data center already for submitting to audits. And that's just the nature of the beast in an IT organization and financial institutions. You need to make sure that your cloud provider will allow that to happen, if they will participate with you. Again, this is a whole thing of, you know, who's in charge of what. It's your data, so you as the provider, you as the customer would be audited, but they would need that to happen. And if they don't have any statement about auditability, you need to ask them about that. That's really important. Along with their certifications. So again, if you work with any kind of personal data, PCI data, health records, anything that's HIPAA related, any of that, make sure you ask your cloud provider what their certifications are. For financial services, it's, you know, SISTRA, SAS 70, and those other international ones, depending on what country you're in. And if you're a multinational, obviously you need to make sure that you understand what the certifications are for the cloud provider in those countries as well. And it's not just a one-time shot, right? They have to keep those certifications updated. If any of you are contractors for the federal government or state and local government, one consideration also is if you need to use a FedRAMP cloud. And there are plenty of them out there, not just AWS. We have other partners that are FedRAMP certified, but then there are different levels of FedRAMP certification, right? So you need to look at what is required by your end customer in government. I mentioned laws and regulations and data placement and notifications. So I think by now we're all aware that there are data privacy laws that, for instance, permit foreign data to be stored in the United States. Certainly, Canada has their own data centers. AWS has set up data centers. Azure has 20 data centers, and that's the primary reason. And I mentioned up here the EU GPDR. And that was the General Protection Data Regulation set up in 1995. That was just refreshed this past year. You might have read about it in the press. There was a little bit of noise about it. But basically, it's refreshing and restating that these are not just recommendations from the EU for all 28 countries. Oh, it's 27, is it now? Shoot, I forgot about that Brexit thing. Well, the UK is going to do the same thing. I mean, they're not going to go off the ranch or whatever. But regardless, they all want to share data because they have to transact business together. So this is a collective regulation. It's actually a requirement now. It's the closest thing they have to saying it's a de facto law. So, if you're operating in those countries, you want to make sure that you're aware of what these are. And this applies to data, but it also applies to access to data. So when we talk about control mechanisms and security, that's exactly what we're talking about. One of the ways you can protect yourself when you move to a private cloud or to a public cloud and a multi-tenant cloud is to set up VPCs or virtual private clouds. And you can think of these as basically your own dedicated cloud resources with your own networks, your own subnets that you control and you manage. So your cloud provider does not do that. You do that. So you need to take on more of the management and more of the control. But the trade-off with that is you have more security that you can build into your applications when you use multi-tenant clouds. AWS has them, Azure has them, Google, you can set them up on Google, but there's a lot of services, there's a lot of cloud providers out there that have VPCs. That's one way to mitigate your risk. And then lastly, identity and access control. So one of the things that developers love to do is just get access to all the different services that could possibly be available in a multi-tenant cloud or in private clouds, because they're never sure at any given time what they're going to need to develop. And they just want to have all of those tools and languages and libraries available. And they want to have access to every VM if possible. And they want the VMs turned on and running all the time, and they never want to tag. Well, what happens when we have that kind of environment? We've got, VM sprawl. We don't know which VMs are really running something that's valuable or which ones we can actually just, destroy. And we don't really understand, who's got access to what. One of the things you can do in CloudForms is you can set up security and access controls of who has access to what VMs and what services. But what I always recommend on a public cloud is to look at the services they provide and then develop personas within your organization, and then basically assign what resources those personas can have, and then attach or associate particular employees and their access control to those personas, and keep that updated, because that way then you have a manageable environment. So if you know developers in this line of business that need this set of tools and need these resources and can have these kinds of instance types running on AWS, then you've got that locked and you've got that covered. Whereas another line of business or operations folks may not have access to those because that's not their application. So don't forget that, again, what you're doing in your data center needs to be applied to public cloud. It should not be the Wild West when you move to public cloud. The dreaded cloud lock-in. Dun, dun, dun. I love Gartner and IDC and all these guys. I mean, you just pick up any one of the trades, and they're talking about vendor lock-in, and they're making it sound so dire. There are so many services now that are available on these public clouds. you can create 100% cloud-native applications on one cloud provider and run very effectively, high performance, multiple regions, high availability zones, failover, resiliency, got your backup, got your storage locked down. And that is great if that's your direction. But we have many enterprise customers that are required to use multiple clouds. That's just their direction. They're going to use multiple clouds. They're not going to put all their eggs in one basket, whatever kind of euphemism you want to use for that. Or because Google is friendlier to developers, so our developers want to use a GCP, whereas production level guys they want to use AWS because you have better operational management of that environment. So you need to be prepared for a multi-cloud deployment, and when you do that, then you have to look at, well, what is vendor lock-in? Some things you want to consider. Try if you're in a development environment. You're doing cloud first, really investigate containers and what containers can bring to you, because you can develop with containers and then deploy on multiple platforms, both virtual as well as private clouds and public clouds. So you have an economy of scale there. It's also, if you're using microservices, a lot easier to patch code than to take a monolithic application and try to patch it that way. There are many sessions on containers and microservices here, so if you weren't at DevNation, don't worry that you're still covered with the summit sessions on OpenShift, containers, Atomic, as well as our friends at Google are going to be covering Kubernetes. So do look at that and see if that's going to help alleviate the multi-cloud deployment. Look at standardized images. So one of the things that we're concerned about is the vendor supply chain. And that's where standardized images come through. Everything from Red Hat is signed. Every package is signed. When you download something from RHN, you know and you trust that Red Hat has tested it, and it's been hardened, and we support it. If you're using from another vendor something that's not signed, that may not be a big problem day one, but it could be down the road, because you don't know how that's going to, you don't know what the security vulnerabilities are, you don't know how you're going to patch those, and you may not even be sure how it's going to be updated. So you really need to look at using standardized images and making sure that you understand that your cloud provider is part of your supply chain, just like your other vendors are. And then finally, look at consistent operational models across your clouds. And that's where a tool like CloudForms can be helpful. But you shouldn't have different operational models just because you're doing things one way in AWS, but you might want to do them differently in Google. You really need, again, an economy of scale if you're using multiple clouds to avoid lock-in. So I talked a little bit about multiple clouds. Let's look at the Certified Cloud and Service Provider Program. And I'm only going to say that once because that's a lot, even if I've had a lot of coffee. So if I say CCSP, that's what I mean. I mean our Certified Cloud and Service Provider Program. So we developed a program about 5 years ago, and we had AWS, and then a couple of our other partners like IBM and Fujitsu were also in the program, but it was early days. I think we had maybe 7 or 8. The program has grown exponentially, and the reason why it's grown exponentially is because of the demand from you, our customer, and also from what we see as more mature public cloud models and more services available. And as I said at the top of the session, more blurring of lines where a managed service provider or an SI can now act as a cloud broker or a cloud provider themselves. So we developed basically a set of certification requirements for our cloud providers. That's number one. Number two, we developed consumption models to help you use Red Hat products on public clouds and understand what your costs are. And number three, we have support models that are offered to you through our public cloud providers, whether they're a managed service provider or a true multi-tenant cloud. So those are the three really linchpins of the CCSP program. And what that means is it ensures you stability and consistency when you move to public clouds and you use cloud providers. And what do I mean by that? I'll explain that in a minute. So we've got some of the largest cloud providers. This is our beauty shot. We love to show off our cloud providers. Many of you, I'm sure, were waiting with bated breath because last year I got asked, why isn't Azure in your program? So yay, we did that in November. So welcome Microsoft, as well as AWS, GCP, Rackspace, and some of the others, SoftLayer, et cetera. And I do have links at the end of this presentation, which you'll be able to download to things like our certification catalog. So this is obviously, not all of our providers, all 260. This is just showing you where our cloud providers are within the Magic Quadrant. And again, I know it's a bit of an eye chart, but you can look at this later. The point here is that we offer Red Hat Enterprise Linux 6 and 7 through our cloud partners. We highly recommend that they certify an image. If they're a managed service provider, they can offer you a RHEL image that's customized, sure, but that's based on a RHEL image that we've actually given them. For our multi-tenant cloud providers like AWS, Azure, Google, they must certify an image. It's a requirement for our program. So what that means is that they submit basically a script to us. It's very similar to how we certify hardware vendors as well. And that either passes or it doesn't. So things like making sure that SE Linux is in enforcing mode, that's a critical check mark that we say, yes, you have to be able to provide that to the customer, to the end customer. So if you're using Red Hat Enterprise Linux on any one of our CCSPs, it is the same as if you were getting it directly from Red Hat. And that means then that we support the cloud provider on the back end, because we're able to do that because we know that they've certified an image with us. Obviously for public cloud, infrastructure, hosting, and managed services. A little bit about cloud access. So one of the things that comes along with consumption models is looking at how we can help our existing customers. And one of the things that we hear over and over again is predictability when you're moving to public cloud, and that costs can be just out of control. So we offer you the option of taking a subscription that you've already purchased from Red Hat and moving it to a public cloud, and we call that cloud access. Very easy to use. We have a registration page on redhat.com. The key proponent there is that you can use satellite, as I said before, to manage. If you're using AWS, you have another option. We can actually share out private AMIs with you, and those AMIs are basically managed directly on AWS. One thing that I neglected to mention, I should mention, is for all of our CCSPs, they have to stand up an update mechanism. So if they're a managed service provider, they could use satellite or RHN. If they're a multi-tenant cloud, they have to use our Red Hat update infrastructure, and that basically feeds all content. It's a content server directly on their cloud in every single region. So if you're consuming on demand, pay as you go, you always have updates for RHEL directly on that cloud provider if they're a CCSP. If they're not a CCSP and they're providing RHEL, then you need to do some investigation, because that's, we don't know how they're doing management and updates. Red Hat, besides predictable pricing, allows you to be compliant when you move to a public cloud. So there's always a question of how many subscriptions do I need? How many am I using up? If you're an operations person, Cloud Access helps you manage that. And you maintain your direct support relationship with Red Hat. So again, when you're using multiple clouds or hybrid cloud, you don't want to have different support models, right? You want to have consistency with who you call for support, and you want that support organization to really understand the infrastructure on which you're deploying. And so if you have a cloud access enabled partner, we know that that's definitely the case. We talked about utility models. That's basically pay-as-you-go. That could be hourly, monthly, or yearly. I've just noted here, and I'm almost out of time, so I do want to leave time for questions, but some of the use cases it's good for. I would not recommend cloud access for bursting. And I'm assuming that you guys all know what bursting is. It's just going out, and consuming resources when you've got overcapacity within your data center. Because Cloud Access is taking an annual subscription and moving it to the cloud. So we're assuming that's more like a production workload or a permanent app dev environment that you want to set up, like an OpenShift environment that you want to set up. If you've got ephemeral VMs or bursting requirements, really the pay-as-you-go is a better consumption model for you. Understanding that that's temporary processing and DR testing as well. Here are all the products that we have available through Cloud Access. So I said before, for on-demand, it's RHEL 6 and 7. But we have our complete portfolio enabled for Cloud Access. and depending on what the platform is. Now, when I say it's available for cloud access and we support, what that means is we have within our test harness set up with our quality engineering teams testing on these platforms. So if you don't see your cloud provider up here, let's say you're a Gluster customer and you don't see your cloud provider up here, that means that we don't stand, that it could possibly work, and we'll work with you, and support will work with you to ensure that we can get that testing done. But this is what we have, you know, GA that we fully support. Cloud access enabled partners, so globally AWS, Google, and Azure, and then we have, and rackspace powered by Red Hat. And then we have just a ton of partners in Japan. We love our Japanese partners, and they see the value in it. So you can see some of our OEM partners up there like NEC and Fujitsu, but others, you know, telecoms like NTT and SoftBank as well. So in summary, understand, you know, what your options are for private and public clouds and for multi-cloud solutions. Understand, you know, what your risks of your workloads are, what the pitfalls are. Do your homework in that area. Understand data management as well as cloud management. Do take advantage of some of the sessions here today or here this week on that for both private and public clouds. Understand, you know, if you're going to move to a public cloud or use a public cloud provider, do some work with us to figure out if your cloud provider is certified by us. And understand, you know, what your consumption models are. And if you want to take advantage of cloud access, you know, we can certainly work with you on that. And then repeat as necessary, because this won't be, this is a challenge, right? Every opportunity we have, you know, to deploy hybrid clouds, it comes up over and over again depending on what our application needs are. Well, thank you for your attention.